Hello and welcome to Module 5, where we will study cross-cultural negotiation. Our aims in this session is to improve how we negotiate with other cultures. Our objectives will be to explore cultural differences and also to explore time orientation. Now, bear in mind that with more than 190 countries in the world, it will not be practical to explain each culture. However, once we understand the concept of cross-cultural communication, cultural difference, then as marketers we can research each culture that we intend to do business with. When we go on holiday abroad, we might think of intercultural experiences as fun, exotic and even entertaining. However, thought leaders in cross-cultural marketing, such as Dr. Hofstede, once stated something very interesting. He stated that culture is more often a source of conflict than of synergy, and that cultural differences are a nuisance at best and often a disaster. Wow, what a contrast. Now, as marketers, our aim is to turn what others might think of as disasters and nuisances into opportunities. Hence, we should do our best to become culturally aware. In business, one of the most basic sources of cultural differences is context. Now, in a high context culture, there are many contextual elements that will help people to understand the rules. As a result, much is taken for granted. Let's look at an example. In the West, obtaining a signed agreement or a signed contract, and then the agreements made in that contract, is more important than going to the restaurant to maintain relationships. Let's look at a low context culture where in fact very little is taken for granted. This means that more explanation is needed. For example, let's look at a similar situation in the East. There, a signed contract would mean a lot less than in the West, because the relationship and the intentions of both parties are considered much more important than the contract itself. Here we can see an attempt to classify various countries according to either a high or low context culture. As we can see, it is proposed that China and Germany are rather high context cultures, whereas countries like Spain, Greece, Italy and the US are classified as being rather low context cultures. It's advisable, before you travel to a new destination, to understand whether you would be dealing with a high context or a low context culture. Another way of looking at differences in context is that some culture rely on explicit messages where everything is stated very clearly, and other cultures rely on implicit messages which does not directly express the meaning. Time orientation is another important cultural difference. If we look at a monochronic orientation, people tend to do one thing at a time. Whereas if we look at monochronic people, it is stated that, or believed that they are also part of the low context culture. Now, in a polychronic culture, human interaction is valued more than time. It's leading to a lesser concern for getting things done. And it is stated that polychronic people tend to also belong to the high context culture. Now, as we can imagine, if we have people from a monochronic culture, they might perceive others from a polyculture as being less efficient, and that's not necessarily the case. So an understanding of this concept will be really helpful. There was an attempt made by researchers to categorize countries according to being either monochronic or polychronic. And as we can see, we've got Germany, Canada, Switzerland, Australia, the United States and Scandinavia being monochronic, whereas Saudi Arabia, France, Egypt, Greece, Mexico and the Philippines are examples of polychronic cultures. Now, we would like to demonstrate a practical implication of what might happen when there's different time orientations. We'll have a look at the United States and Japan. Typically, in the United States, the workforce will spend more time on the implementation rather than the development of a process. And if we was to contrast the same process to Japan, you would find that the workforce there will spend more time on developing the process and less time on the implementation of the process. Cultural awareness is quite important. We would like to leave you with a brief case study of how useful it is to be sensitive to other cultures. Google sent clocks as gifts to their business partners abroad in many different countries. As it turned out, in the Chinese culture, sending a clock to somebody means your time is up. Now, we don't think that was Google's intention, and we certainly hope that their Chinese partners will forgive them for making that mistake.